Okay, welcome to the second episode of this Livewire series. So let's just do a quick review of the first episode. We're looking at wisdom. We looked at the process of wisdom, Habad, Chokmah, to hear, Bina, to discern, Dat, to become. And then after that, we talked about this whole idea of foolishness. What is foolishness? Well, foolishness really is not the lack of wisdom, but it's the imbalance of wisdom. A fool is someone who doesn't lack wisdom, but self-discipline. They have that mandate, that calling upon their life, that understanding of what they should do, what success looks like, but they allow themselves to be pulled in different directions, either by bad advice or their own passions or their own personality. What we're going to do today, though, however, is begin to look at this idea of 6 elements of wisdom. Now, first thing I need to say is I've actually got this source material from somewhere else. This is not something I've created. Author, Edward de Bono, came up with the original idea, but I have changed it. I have altered some of the elements. I think I've improved them and made them much more practical. I've also connected it to biblical wisdom because this book is a secular book. Thirdly, and most importantly, what I've done is I've created a template. So as an organization, we are kingdom-centric, we are discipleship-led, and we're template-driven. What I mean by that is we believe as leaders, our job is to empower people, not be needed by people. So we create templates for discipleship and evangelism and wisdom and many other things in order that you don't need us. You can go away and become that wise, and we're hoping this template can help you. So it's a template to help you make wise decisions at any time and anywhere. So we're going to look at these 6 elements of wisdom, and you might be thinking as you hear this, which element of wisdom do I naturally default to, and are there elements of wisdom that I don't use but should use? So Edward de Bono uses colours, which is great. Again, I've altered it slightly. Feel free to look at his book if you ever want to, just to compare notes. Maybe you might find some of his material more helpful. So let's look at the first type of wisdom. We'll look at the white hat or white wisdom. So Edward de Bono uses this idea of hats, putting on the hat of wisdom. So what is white wisdom? Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost? So white wisdom is about data. It's about doing the research. It's about asking questions like this. What do we not know that we need to know? Who has done this before, and how can we gain their wisdom? Are there any statistics out there that will help us? What resources are needed or going to be needed? So the white hat is where you sit down, a bit like the guy with a laboratory coat, and he does an experiment. He gets the information. Before we run ahead and make a decision, we find out all the information. This is particularly important in relationships. You know, so often we have broken relationships because we heard something that someone said, someone else said. And we didn't gather the information and find out for sure. Did they really say that? What did they mean by that? But in other areas of our plans, we need to get the data. But on its own, that is limited. We need more than that. Whoever watches the wind will not plant. Whoever looks at the clouds will not reap. So Ecclesiastes warns us, don't be someone who's constantly just trying to get more information. At some point, you have to pull the trigger. At some point, you have to give it a go. I believe you have to give it a go for you to know. It's going to take a while. You've got to try things out. You've got to experiment at some point. But white data is, or white hat thinking, white wisdom is really, really helpful. And then you have red wisdom. This is the danger sign. A prudent man sees danger and takes refuge, but the simple keep going and suffer for it. You know, God's really good. He'll often show us the danger signs. I was having a conversation with someone, a pastor, the other day, and we just talked about how often we're about to appoint someone that we thought were going to be great in a position, and just before we appointed them, something blew up. Maybe they reacted really badly to a situation. It was a bit like a warning sign from God saying, hold back. You know, don't lay your hands on people too quickly. So all sorts of danger signs. If we ignore them, we will suffer for them. But again, there's a limitation to this kind of wisdom. You know, you'll be in meetings sometimes and there's that person who's always super negative, always sees the problem. It's helpful, but not if that's the main thing that's driving you forward. Jesus told him, don't be afraid, just believe. So, seeing danger is good as long as you realize the purpose of that is for you to work around it. Okay, I see the danger here, so I'm not just going to run away. I'm not going to be afraid because maybe this is something God's calling me to. What do I put in place now to circumvent that problem? So you want to see the danger. You don't want to run away from the danger. You just want to figure out, how do I get around that problem? Is there a way around that problem? And of course, if it's not sin, if it's part of that ultimate goal, then you want to find out what that is. Thirdly, we've got the yellow hat, or positivity. The hope of the righteous brings joy, but the expectation of the wicked will perish. This is where we expect the best. This is where we ask questions like, what's the best that could possibly happen? I always believe you have to have the end in mind with any goal. So you need to ask these kind of questions. What is the best possible outcome? What do we need if this goes better than we expected? What extra support do I need if this is a huge success? And what might people do if this goes really well? Particularly, I think, in Christian ministry, we often do things and we talk about having faith, but reality is our preparation says we don't have faith it's really going to happen. We like to feel and we step out in faith, but I don't think we really plan for, what if this goes really well? What if this actually works? And we need to do that. It's a form of wisdom. Again, it has limitations. There are problems. Do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty in your heart. Some people are super positive, but they don't apply the other elements of wisdom, and they rush off. They say things, they think things, they do things, and they just react. And it's great because they're good-hearted, and those kind of people usually are people who are full of faith. Those kind of people are usually quite caring, loving people, but they get themselves into trouble. So again, it's about balance. It's about the self-discipline of knowing, well, I'm really drawn to this form of wisdom, but I need to make sure I have these other elements of wisdom in my life. Otherwise, I'm going to get pulled away from that one thing that God's calling me to do. The blue hat, I put here intuition, but really this is about being led by the Spirit of God. For to one is given the word of wisdom through the Spirit. So I'm sure you've been in this situation. I know there have been times in my life where God has given me what sometimes is referred to as a word of wisdom. What I mean by that is God drops wisdom in your heart or your mind that you would not naturally have thought of. Particularly when I was younger, especially. I hadn't maybe learnt some principles. There were just times of grace where I was in this situation and just this idea came to me. Now, what happens a lot to me, I'll be honest with you, is I might have a problem or a decision to make, and I'm not sure what to do. I'm not thinking about it. I'll go to sleep, and quite often, early in the morning, I'll wake up with the idea, and I've begun to recognize when it's God. Normally, I've never thought of that idea or that solution ever before, and it's just come to me. And it's the first thing I think of when I wake up in the morning. It happens to me, I would say, 4 or 5 times a year that happens to me. There's actually some science that certain people, they get great ideas in the morning. There's a reason for it, as well as a chemical or neurological reason for that. But I believe it's the Holy Spirit who's speaking to me, and there are certain principles I look for when it happens, which I won't go into now. So we want to be led by the Holy Spirit. We want to make sure we've got time for God to speak to us about the decision. And that's when we talk about this idea of chokmah, insight, going to places to hear wisdom. We've got to make sure one of the main places we go to and give space to is God. But there is a limit even to this. We need to ask, have we created time to meditate on it? What is the Holy Spirit saying to me? Am I applying godly principles I've learnt. What does my gut instinct say? Now, gut instinct is good for some people and bad for others. So the limit here is, if you have become wise or become wiser, you have godly principles, your gut instinct is going to be good. I feel like I've got a good gut instinct now. My gut instinct when I was in my early 20s was awful because I didn't have those principles. I would just go for my feelings. I would go for my personality. It wasn't always a good thing. So the limitation is that the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? Jeremiah says our heart will pull us in all the wrong directions. We literally lose our minds. So we want to go with feelings to some extent, but when we know we can trust them, because sometimes we can't always trust our feelings. Sometimes they're helpful. It's God teaching us. It's God inspiring us. It's God giving us intuition. Sometimes it's just the heart, and the heart is evil. Sometimes it can be distracted quite easily by evil. Perhaps a better way of saying it. So the fifth element is the black hat, which is really about logic, or you could say common sense. For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. The old phrase is, the problem with common sense is it's not that common, as some people say. Common sense is important. This is where we ask the following questions. Does this make common sense? Is it rational? Does it add up? Is it the next obvious step? Particularly if you have a plan, God's been speaking to you, is this the next obvious step? Does this fit in line with what God said in the past? We'll talk more about that in our third episode of this Livewire series, when we talk about how to communicate wisely. Because you want to communicate the future, if you have a plan or a vision, by drawing from the past, showing it's the next obvious step. But there is, again, limitations. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. So we can't simply go off common sense, because God does things that are uncommon sometimes. He does things out of the ordinary. So again, it's about balancing these things together. And then finally, the green hat, creativity. The intelligent man is always open to new ideas. In fact, he looks for them. So we have a different way of doing this. We like to ask certain questions like, is there another way of doing this? Is there another angle to look at this? Is there a reason why we've always done it this way? Is there an answer to be found in emptiness? At this point, I often introduce what I call the creativity equation. And the reason I talk about this is, again, giving people just ways of rediscovering their creativity. Creativity is not something you gain, it's something you lose over time. You know, a 2-year-old is incredibly creative. A 3-year-old is incredibly creative. It's something we lose. So how do we gain it? I even have a kind of template for that. So the way we look at this is think about the purpose, the ultimate goal, and then think about how would you normally do that, the default idea. Get rid of that default idea. Imagine the way you normally do that, you can't normally do. It's impossible. And ask the question, what would I do without the default way I would normally do this? So an obvious thing would be, what if we had to do church, but we had no buildings? How would we do church? What that's going to do is give you ideas you wouldn't normally think of, and then you bring back the default idea, but now you have ideas that maybe you wouldn't have thought of before. I mean, look what happened during COVID-19. It was basically this equation lived out. There were things that we couldn't do anymore, so people came up with new ideas. We've now got the church buildings back, we've now got the congregations back, but there are new ideas that we wouldn't have thought of if it wasn't for taking that default idea away. Again, there's a limitation. Remember the former things, those of long ago. So new ideas are great, they're wonderful, but make sure you remember the past. How are those two things connected? I had somebody once say to me, they gave me an idea, and I said to them quite quickly, actually, no, we probably won't do that. And they said to me, oh, wow, Paul, you surprised me, because I normally think you're open to new ideas, but you don't seem open to new ideas. I said, no, the problem's not that I'm not open to new ideas. The problem is this isn't a new idea. This is something we looked at, we thought about, we prayed about, got some advice from God, got a different way forward. So remembering the former things, remember the principles that God has taught you and things he has shown you in the past is important. So I wanted to create a simple template, a template that you could apply to any plan or any idea and simplify it. I'm going to go through that really quickly for you, and then you can apply it to the plan that you're thinking of right now that we talked about in the first episode in the collaboration section. So, white, wisdom. Question, what research do we need to do? Action point, how do I resource this? Red. Question, what could go wrong? Action point, how do I danger-proof this? What do I do to danger-proof this? Yellow. Question, what could go right? Action, how do I prepare for success? If everything went great, what do I need to do to prepare for that? Blue. Question, what has the Holy Spirit said? Action, how can I meditate on this? Or how can I create space to hear God? Make sure he's giving me advice as well as everybody else. Black. Question, does this make common sense? Action, what is the next obvious step? Is this an obvious step? What is the next obvious thing I need to do? And then finally, green. Is there a better way to do this? Action. What does the creativity equation produce? So this is a simple template. In the collaboration section of the first episode, I actually think of a plan or an idea. What we're going to do in this collaboration time now is we're going to apply that template to your idea, to your plan, and we see what it reveals to us and how we can gradually go through this process of becoming wiser in what we do. Okay, so please download the documents, discuss the questions, do the activity, and then disciple others in the things that we've learned in this episode.
Hello, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Livewire. If you're interested in finding out more about this topic, I'd like to recommend the book Kingdom Patterns: How to Discover God's Direction.